"You saved my son, and the moon itself led you to him." The words echoed across the silent valley, carrying a weight that made every warrior lower his eyes. Emily Carter stood frozen beneath the silver glow of the full moon, her worn gray cloak fluttering in the cold mountain wind as if she had stepped into someone else's destiny. Before her, the most powerful Alpha King alive knelt on one knee, his hand resting over his heart instead of reaching for the ceremonial sword at his side. Behind him, hundreds of royal wolves remained perfectly still, their banners rippling softly against the night sky while the little white wolf pup pressed happily against Emily's boots, completely unaware that every breath around him had stopped. Only 3 days earlier, none of this had seemed possible. 3 days earlier, Emily had been nothing more than a forgotten Omega with nowhere left to go. The morning had begun beneath dark clouds that covered the mountains surrounding Silver Ridge Pack, turning the familiar pine forest into a place that felt colder than usual. Emily walked through the center of the village with her head lowered, carrying a worn basket filled with fresh bread she had baked before sunrise. She greeted people with quiet kindness, but almost no one returned her smile. Some looked away. Others whispered behind her back. A few simply pretended she wasn't there. Being ignored had become easier than expecting kindness. She had long accepted that hope often arrived dressed as disappointment. At 23, Emily was known throughout the pack for 2 things. She was an Omega whose wolf had never fully awakened, and she possessed an unusual gift for calming frightened animals with nothing more than a gentle touch. In a society that admired strength above everything else, neither quality earned respect. To many, compassion looked too much like weakness. The sound of distant bells suddenly drifted through the village square. Every conversation stopped. Children hurried toward the ceremonial grounds while merchants abandoned their stalls. Today was the choosing ceremony, the day every unmated wolf secretly dreamed about. Emily knew she should have stayed home, but duty pulled her forward. She carried fresh bread for the gathering tables because even forgotten people still had responsibilities. As she approached the ancient stone circle, excitement buzzed through the crowd like electricity before a summer storm. Young alphas stood proudly beside their families. Confident Omegas adjusted elegant dresses sewn for this single moment. Emily glanced down at her simple gray clothes and quietly reminded herself that expectations only made disappointment heavier. She moved toward the edge of the gathering, hoping to finish her work unnoticed. High above the valley, hidden beyond the drifting clouds, something small and frightened let out a faint cry that no one else seemed to hear. Emily paused for only a heartbeat. A strange warmth settled quietly inside her chest before disappearing as quickly as it had come. She looked toward the distant forest, unable to explain why it suddenly felt as though someone, somewhere, was waiting for her. The ceremony began as the first rays of morning slipped between the towering pines, bathing the ancient stone circle in pale golden light. One by one, the unmated wolves stepped forward, greeted by warm smiles, hopeful glances, and whispered blessings from their families. Emily remained near the serving tables, quietly placing fresh bread into woven baskets while pretending not to notice the joyful laughter surrounding her. She had attended enough choosing ceremonies to understand that some dreams belong to other people. The village elder raised his weathered staff, and silence settled over the gathering. Ancient words honoring the moon goddess drifted across the valley while every heart seemed to beat in anticipation. Emily lowered her eyes, hoping the ceremony would pass without anyone remembering she existed. Unfortunately, fate often noticed those who wished to disappear. A young alpha named Nathan Holloway stepped confidently into the center of the stone circle. For nearly a year, many villagers had assumed he might eventually choose Emily simply because they had grown up together. They had shared childhood games beneath these same trees before rank and expectation built invisible walls between them. Emily had never allowed herself to believe the rumors completely, but a quiet corner of her heart had carried the smallest spark of hope. Nathan looked toward her only briefly before turning his attention to a graceful Omega dressed in deep blue. Her name was Olivia Brooks, admired throughout the pack for her beauty, confidence, and powerful wolf spirit. Nathan smiled with unmistakable certainty as he offered Olivia his hand. The crowd erupted into applause. Emily joined them, forcing her own hands to clap even while something inside her became painfully still. She reminded herself that kindness sometimes meant celebrating another person's happiness, even when it quietly buried your own. As Nathan and Olivia accepted the elder's blessing, scattered whispers drifted through the gathering. Emily caught only fragments. Poor Emily. She never had a chance. She should leave the pack. Some wolves simply are not meant to belong. None of the words were spoken loudly, yet every sentence seemed to find her. She carefully lifted the empty bread basket and slipped away before anyone noticed the tears threatening to gather in her eyes. No one tried to stop her. The forest welcomed her with cool shade and the familiar scent of pine needles warmed by the late morning sun. Emily followed an old trail that few people used anymore, allowing each quiet step to soften the ache inside her chest. Birds sang overhead while a gentle breeze carried the distant sound of the village celebration farther and farther away until only silence remained. She reached a small stream where clear water danced across smooth stones and finally allowed herself to breathe. Kneeling beside the bank, she dipped her fingers into the icy current. The water soothed her trembling hands, but it could not quiet the strange feeling growing beneath her ribs. It was the same mysterious warmth she had felt earlier that morning. This time it lingered. Emily slowly lifted her head. Somewhere beyond the dense trees, carried on the wind so softly that anyone else might have missed it entirely, came a tiny cry. It was weak, frightened, and heartbreakingly alone. She stood without thinking. The basket slipped gently from her fingers onto the moss below. Every instinct she possessed urged her toward the sound, as though the forest itself had whispered her name and was asking her to trust it one more time. Emily followed the faint cries through a maze of towering pines, her worn boots sinking into damp earth softened by the previous night's rain. The farther she walked, the quieter the forest became. Even the cheerful songs of birds slowly disappeared, replaced by a peaceful stillness that seemed to hold its breath. She wrapped her arms around herself as a cool breeze drifted through the branches above, carrying with it a scent unlike anything she had ever known. It smelled of winter air, fresh cedar, and something ancient that stirred a quiet curiosity deep inside her heart. The tiny cry came again, weaker now. Emily quickened her pace, carefully stepping over exposed roots and fallen branches until she reached a narrow clearing where sunlight spilled through the leaves like ribbons of gold. There, beneath the shelter of an overturned log, lay the smallest wolf pup she had ever seen. Its snowy white fur shimmered softly despite the dirt clinging to it, and its pale blue eyes searched the empty forest with frightened uncertainty. One tiny paw was caught beneath a tangle of thorny vines, preventing the little creature from escaping on its own. Emily slowly knelt several feet away, making sure not to frighten it further. The little wolf immediately tried to pull back, but the tangled vines held it in place. Its frightened eyes met hers, filled not with anger but with confusion and exhaustion. Emily felt her chest tighten. She knew that look. She had seen the same loneliness every time she looked into her own reflection after being reminded she did not belong. Keeping her voice barely above a whisper, she spoke as though comforting a frightened child. "It is all right. I am not here to hurt you." The tiny wolf watched her carefully. She extended one hand, palm open, giving it time to decide. Several long moments passed before the little nose twitched gently, catching her scent. Instead of growling or pulling away again, the pup slowly relaxed. Emily smiled with quiet relief. Animals had always trusted her long before people ever did. She carefully untangled the vines one branch at a time, taking care not to cause the frightened creature any more discomfort. As the final vines slipped away, the tiny wolf stumbled forward instead of running into the forest. To Emily's surprise, it leaned unsteadily against her knee as though asking for help. She hesitated only briefly before slipping both hands beneath its small body and lifting it into her arms. The pup weighed almost nothing. Its soft fur felt unusually warm, and its tiny heartbeat fluttered steadily against her chest. "You have been very brave," she whispered. "But you cannot stay here alone." The little wolf looked up at her with strangely intelligent eyes, almost as though it understood every word. It rested its head beneath her chin and released a small sigh that sounded remarkably like relief. Emily could not explain why the simple gesture filled her eyes with tears. Perhaps both of them had been searching for someone willing to care without asking questions. She turned toward the trail leading to an abandoned hunter's cabin she sometimes used during heavy storms. It was small, quiet, and hidden deep within the forest where few pack members ever wandered. If she could gather fresh water, herbs, and a warm blanket, the little traveler might recover quickly. As she disappeared beneath the tall pines with the tiny wolf sleeping peacefully in her arms, neither of them noticed the enormous paw prints pressed into the soft mud only a few yards away. Fresh tracks surrounded the clearing, and whatever had left them had been searching desperately for the missing pup long before Emily had arrived. The abandoned hunter's cabin rested beside a narrow creek hidden beneath towering evergreens, its weathered wooden walls softened by years of moss and climbing ivy. Emily gently pushed open the creaking door with her shoulder, careful not to disturb the tiny wolf sleeping against her chest. Dust floated through beams of afternoon sunlight spilling across the rough floor, but the little shelter remained dry and surprisingly warm. She laid the pup on a folded wool blanket she had left there months earlier and hurried outside to collect fresh water from the creek. When she returned, the little wolf had opened its pale blue eyes and was quietly watching every movement she made. There was no fear in its expression now, only cautious curiosity. Emily smiled as she dipped a clean cloth into the cool water and carefully brushed away dirt caught within its snowy fur. The tiny creature stayed perfectly still, occasionally letting out a soft sigh that sounded almost grateful. Once she finished cleaning its coat, she gathered several familiar herbs growing beside the cabin and gently crushed their leaves between her fingers. The fresh scent filled the room as she prepared a simple remedy her grandmother had taught her years before. She carefully wrapped the little paw with soft linen torn from an old apron and whispered comforting words throughout the process. The wolf watched her face without looking away, as though trying to memorize every expression. When she finally offered a small wooden bowl filled with fresh water, the pup drank eagerly before looking back up at her with bright, unusually thoughtful eyes. Emily laughed quietly for the first time that day. The sound surprised even her. It had been weeks since anything had made her forget the loneliness waiting beyond the forest. As evening settled over the mountains, she searched the small cupboard and discovered enough dried vegetables, oats, and herbs to prepare a simple soup over the stone fireplace. The comforting aroma soon filled the cabin while the tiny wolf wandered carefully across the floor, its movements growing steadier with every passing minute. At one point it stumbled toward the doorway, sniffed the cool evening air, then immediately turned back and curled beside Emily's boots instead of leaving. She reached down to gently scratch behind its ears. "You could go home if you wanted," she whispered. "But I am happy you stayed." The little wolf answered by resting one small paw on her shoe. Emily could not help smiling again. Outside, the peaceful silence suddenly shifted. Birds hidden high among the trees burst into flight all at once. Somewhere deeper within the forest came the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps moving across fallen leaves. Emily instinctively stood and looked through the dusty window. 3 wolves from Silver Ridge Pack emerged between the trees carrying lanterns as the last light of day faded into dusk. At their front walked Mason Turner, one of the younger Alpha Scouts known for taking every assignment far too seriously. His sharp eyes swept across the clearing before stopping on the fresh tracks leading directly toward the cabin. Emily quietly stepped away from the window, her heartbeat quickening. She had done nothing wrong, yet something deep inside warned her not to reveal the little traveler. The tiny wolf sensed her unease almost instantly. It hurried to her side and pressed against her leg without making a sound. Then a firm knock echoed through the wooden cabin. "Emily," Mason called from outside. "We know someone came through this part of the forest. Open the door. We need to ask you a few questions." Inside the quiet cabin, Emily looked down at the small white wolf leaning trustingly against her ankle, and for reasons she could not explain, she already knew she would protect it, no matter what waited on the other side of that door. Emily remained perfectly still as the knocking echoed through the small cabin. The little white wolf looked up at her with wide blue eyes, then quietly slipped behind her legs as though it understood that strangers stood outside. Emily took one slow breath before opening the wooden door just enough to see Mason Turner and the 2 scouts waiting beneath the fading evening sky. Their lanterns cast long golden shadows across the clearing while the cool mountain breeze carried the scent of pine and damp earth between them. Mason offered a polite nod, though his expression remained tense. "We are searching for an unusual animal," he said. "Several hunters reported strange tracks crossing our territory. Have you seen anything out here today?" Emily hesitated for only a heartbeat before gently shaking her head. "I have been gathering herbs since this afternoon. I have not seen anything dangerous." Mason studied her face carefully. He had always known Emily as someone who rarely lied, and perhaps that was why uncertainty flickered briefly across his eyes. One of the younger scouts stepped forward and glanced past the doorway into the cabin. "May we take a quick look?" he asked. Emily instinctively placed one hand against the doorframe. Her voice remained calm, but it carried a quiet confidence she had never heard within herself before. "There is nothing inside except an old cabin and my supper." For several long seconds no one spoke. The wind rustled through the tall trees overhead until Mason finally exhaled and nodded. "Very well. If you notice anything unusual, return to the village immediately. Whatever crossed these woods does not belong here." Emily thanked him softly and watched the three scouts disappear between the pines, their lantern lights gradually fading into the darkness. Only after the last glow vanished did she close the door and lean against it with a quiet sigh of relief. The little wolf emerged from its hiding place and trotted toward her, brushing gently against her ankle before looking up with an expression that almost resembled gratitude. Emily knelt and smiled. "You stayed quiet the whole time. That was very brave." The tiny wolf wagged its tail once before carefully placing its small paw into her open hand. The simple gesture made warmth spread through her chest. She noticed the bandage around its paw had become loose, so she carefully removed it to examine the injury once more. To her surprise, the wound looked better than it had only a few hours earlier, yet a faint redness still remained. Emily reached for fresh linen and instinctively rested her fingertips against the tiny paw. The moment her skin touched its fur, an unfamiliar warmth flowed through her hands. It was gentle, comforting, and brighter than sunlight reflected on fresh snow. Emily gasped quietly as a soft golden glow surrounded her fingers. The light was not harsh or blinding. Instead, it shimmered like thousands of tiny stars dancing across still water. The little wolf did not appear frightened. It simply watched her with calm blue eyes while the warmth spread slowly across its injured paw. Within moments the remaining soreness faded completely. The pup stretched its leg, took several careful steps across the cabin floor, then bounded happily in a small circle with effortless energy. Emily stared at her own hands in astonishment. The golden light lingered for only an instant before quietly disappearing, leaving nothing behind except the memory of impossible warmth. She whispered to herself, "What just happened?" Before she could search for an answer, the little wolf suddenly turned toward the dark window. Its ears lifted. Its cheerful expression disappeared. Far beyond the cabin, deep within the silent forest, several distant howls rolled across the mountains. They were not cries of anger but calls of determined searchers moving steadily closer with every passing minute. The distant howls drifted through the mountains with calm authority, rising and falling like echoes carried by the wind instead of cries filled with fear. The little white wolf stood perfectly still beside the cabin door, its pale blue eyes shining with sudden excitement. Emily slowly knelt beside it, gently resting one hand on its back. "Do you know who they are?" she whispered. The tiny wolf looked at her for a brief moment before turning toward the forest once again. Its tail moved hopefully, but it remained by her side rather than rushing outside. That simple choice made Emily's heart ache in a way she could not explain. Whatever bond had formed between them over the past day felt strangely natural, as though fate had quietly woven invisible threads around two lonely souls who had needed one another. The howls stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Silence settled over the clearing once again. Even the breeze seemed to pause. Emily slowly rose and stepped onto the small porch, searching the dark forest where moonlight filtered through towering pines. At first she saw nothing except silver mist weaving between the trees. Then shadows began to move. One after another, enormous wolves emerged from the darkness without making a sound. Their coats ranged from charcoal gray to snowy white, each carrying an unmistakable presence of discipline rather than aggression. They formed a wide circle around the clearing but did not advance toward the cabin. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the tiny wolf standing quietly beside Emily. Moments later, several figures dressed in deep black cloaks stepped into the moonlight behind the wolves. Their silver armor reflected the stars, each breastplate bearing the same ancient crest of a crowned wolf beneath a full moon. Emily had never seen that symbol before, yet something about it commanded immediate respect. The guards stopped together and lowered their heads toward the forest path behind them. A tall man appeared from the shadows with slow, steady footsteps. He wore a long black coat that moved gently with the night breeze, and his silver-gray eyes seemed to hold the quiet strength of winter itself. There was nothing hurried about him. He carried no visible weapon. He needed none. The entire forest seemed to recognize his presence before Emily understood who stood before her. The little white wolf suddenly ran forward with joyful energy, crossing the clearing in seconds before stopping directly in front of the stranger. Emily expected the man to scoop the tiny creature into his arms. Instead, he slowly lowered himself onto one knee. His expression, calm until that moment, softened with unmistakable relief. He placed one hand over his heart and bowed his head toward the little wolf. "Thank the moon," he whispered, his voice deep but gentle. "You are safe." The tiny wolf happily pressed against his shoulder before glancing back toward Emily, almost inviting her to come closer. The man followed the pup's gaze and finally looked directly at her. Their eyes met across the quiet clearing. Emily felt no fear, only the overwhelming sense that she had somehow stepped into a story far greater than her own. The stranger stood and approached slowly until only a few feet separated them. His expression held quiet gratitude rather than suspicion. "You found him," he said softly. Emily nodded. He was alone in the forest. The man looked down at the little wolf before returning his gaze to her. "No," he answered with a faint smile touched by emotion. He was never alone. He was being led to the one person willing to see him not for what he was, but for who he needed. Behind him, every royal guard lowered their heads in silent respect, and only then did Emily begin to realize that the man standing before her was not merely a traveler searching for a lost child. He was the Alpha King whose name was spoken with reverence across every pack in the Northern Territories. Emily could barely find her voice. The quiet authority surrounding the stranger had already answered the question forming inside her heart long before anyone spoke his title aloud. The royal guards remained perfectly still, every head respectfully lowered, while the great wolves waited in complete silence around the clearing. Even the wind seemed unwilling to interrupt the moment. The little white wolf trotted happily between Emily and the tall man, looking at each of them as though introducing two old friends who had simply not met until now. The Alpha King smiled gently before kneeling once more beside the tiny creature. He rested a careful hand upon its head, and a soft silver light shimmered briefly beneath the moon. Emily watched in amazement as the little wolf became surrounded by glowing light no brighter than moonbeams reflecting across a quiet lake. Within seconds, the light faded, revealing a young boy no older than 6 years old sitting comfortably on the grass. He had snowy white hair, bright blue eyes, and the same warm smile the little wolf had worn only moments before. Without hesitation, the child stood and hurried back to Emily, wrapping both small arms around her waist as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Emily instinctively embraced him, still struggling to understand what she had just witnessed. The Alpha King's eyes softened even further. "His name is Ethan Ashford," he said quietly. "He is my son." Emily looked down at the little boy, who smiled up at her with complete trust. She remembered the frightened eyes beneath the fallen log, the tiny paw resting in her hand, and the quiet courage that had carried him through the past day. Nothing about him felt different now except that the truth had finally caught up with what her heart had already known. "He is the Crown Prince?" she asked almost in disbelief. The Alpha King nodded. "The only heir to the Northern Kingdom." A respectful silence followed before he continued. 3 days ago Ethan wandered beyond the protected royal lands while following a wounded bird. A sudden storm scattered our escort and hid every trace of his scent. We searched every valley, every mountain pass, and every forest between the northern cliffs and these borders. My guards never rested. Neither did I. Emily looked around at the exhausted faces of the royal guards. Their cloaks carried traces of rain and forest dust, evidence of days spent searching without pause. One older captain stepped forward and smiled kindly. We feared the prince had become hopelessly lost. Instead, we discovered he had been found by the kindest person in these mountains. Emily lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the praise. I only helped because he was alone. The Alpha King slowly shook his head. Many people would have walked away. Others would have seen only an unusual animal. You saw a frightened child who needed comfort. That choice cannot be taught. It comes only from the heart. Ethan reached into his small pocket and carefully removed a smooth blue stone no larger than a walnut. He placed it into Emily's hand with a proud smile. I found this for you, he said. I wanted to say thank you. Emily closed her fingers gently around the little gift, touched by its simplicity. Before she could answer, a royal messenger hurried into the clearing carrying a sealed scroll. He bowed respectfully before the Alpha King. Your Majesty, he said carefully. Scouts from Silver Ridge Pack have arrived at the forest border. They claim the young woman belongs to their territory and request permission to take her back immediately. The peaceful warmth that had filled the clearing faded almost instantly. Ethan tightened his small hand around Emily's fingers, unwilling to let go, while the Alpha King's calm expression became unreadable as he slowly lifted his eyes toward the distant forest beyond the trees. The messenger stepped back into the line of royal guards as silence settled over the clearing once again. No one spoke until the Alpha King slowly turned toward Emily. His silver eyes held neither anger nor suspicion, only calm certainty. Would you like to return with them? He asked gently. The simple question caught Emily by surprise. After everything that had happened, no one had expected her opinion to matter. She lowered her eyes for a moment, thinking of the village she had left behind only yesterday. She remembered the whispers, the pity hidden behind polite smiles, the ceremony where she had quietly disappeared before anyone noticed she was gone. Then she looked down at Ethan, whose small hand still rested securely in hers. I have never wished to run away from my home, she answered honestly. I only wish to belong somewhere. The Alpha King nodded slowly, as though her answer confirmed something he had already begun to understand. He motioned toward the forest path. Bring them here. Several moments later Mason Turner emerged into the clearing with the same two scouts who had visited the cabin earlier. Their confident expressions disappeared the instant they recognized the royal banner surrounding the cabin. All three immediately lowered their heads in respectful greeting. Mason's eyes widened further when he noticed Ethan standing safely beside Emily. He glanced toward the Alpha King and then back to Emily, clearly struggling to understand what had happened. Your Majesty, Mason said carefully, Silver Ridge Pack requests that Emily Carter return with us. She left without permission after today's choosing ceremony. The Alpha King regarded him quietly. Did she commit a crime? Mason hesitated. No, Your Majesty. Did she harm anyone? No, Your Majesty. Then why does your pack seek her? Mason searched for an answer but found none that sounded reasonable beneath the king's calm gaze. Before he could speak again, another group approached from the trees. The Silver Ridge Elder, accompanied by Nathan Holloway and several respected pack members, stepped into the clearing. Nathan looked uncomfortable from the moment he saw Emily standing beside the royal family. The elder bowed deeply. Your Majesty, the young woman belongs to our pack. We have come to escort her home. The Alpha King remained silent for several seconds before speaking in a voice so calm that every word carried even greater weight. Home is not merely the place where someone is born, he said. It is the place where they are valued. No one answered. The king continued, for years this young woman offered kindness to those around her. When my son needed compassion, she gave it freely without knowing his name, his title, or the reward she might receive. Yet those who lived beside her every day failed to recognize the value that was already among them. The elder lowered his gaze in quiet embarrassment. Nathan finally stepped forward. I did not realize. He began softly. Emily gently interrupted him with a peaceful smile. You do not need to explain. We all make choices with the understanding we have at the time. Her kindness only deepened the silence surrounding the clearing. Ethan looked up at his father and tugged lightly on his sleeve. She saved me when nobody else could find me, he said with complete innocence. Can she stay with us? A warm smile touched the Alpha King's face. He rested one hand on his son's shoulder before looking once more toward the Silver Ridge delegation. Emily Carter is free to decide where her future begins, he declared. No pack, no tradition, and no title shall take that choice away from her. Under the silver light of the full moon, the words settled over the valley like a promise, and for the first time in her life, Emily realized that her voice carried exactly the same worth as everyone else's. The forest remained silent long after the Alpha King's words settled over the valley. Emily stood beneath the silver moon with Ethan's small hand resting safely in hers, still trying to understand how a single act of kindness had changed everything. Only 2 days earlier she had believed her future would always be measured by rejection and quiet disappointment. Now she stood surrounded by people who looked at her with genuine respect instead of pity. The Alpha King stepped closer, his calm presence carrying the quiet confidence that had filled the clearing from the moment he arrived. He looked toward the little blue stone Ethan had placed in Emily's hand and smiled. Among my people, he said softly, a gift freely given is never forgotten. Neither is the person who offers hope when hope seems impossible to find. Emily carefully closed her fingers around the smooth stone. I did not save him because he was a prince, she replied. I helped him because he was alone. The Alpha King's expression warmed even more. That is exactly why you succeeded where everyone else failed. Ethan looked from his father to Emily with bright hopeful eyes. Will you come to the castle? He asked. I want to show you the gardens and the lake where the swans live. I want everyone to meet my friend. Emily laughed softly, surprised by how natural the sound felt. She had forgotten what it was like to smile without forcing herself. Before she could answer, the Alpha King extended his hand toward her, not as a command from a ruler but as an invitation offered with sincere respect. No one will decide your path except you, he said. If you wish to return to Silver Ridge, my guards will escort you safely. If you wish to begin somewhere new, the gates of my kingdom will always remain open to you. Emily looked toward the distant mountains where Silver Ridge Pack rested beyond the trees. She carried no anger toward the people she had left behind. Their opinions no longer defined who she was. Then she looked at Ethan, whose hopeful smile reflected the same quiet trust she had first seen in a frightened little wolf beneath a fallen log. Finally, her eyes met the Alpha King's steady gaze. I would like to discover who I can become, she answered. Not because someone finally chose me, but because I have learned to choose myself. The Alpha King nodded with unmistakable pride. Then let this be your first step. As dawn slowly painted the eastern sky with soft shades of gold and rose, the royal guards opened a path through the clearing. Ethan happily slipped one hand into Emily's while reaching for his father's hand with the other. Together the three of them began walking toward the waiting road that led north through the mountains. Behind them, the members of Silver Ridge Pack watched in thoughtful silence, many realizing too late that the greatest treasure in their community had never been hidden. It had simply been overlooked. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine through the valley as the first rays of sunlight touched the forest where everything had begun. Emily glanced down at the little blue stone resting safely in her palm before smiling toward the horizon. She had entered the woods believing she had lost her place in the world. She left them knowing that true belonging is never earned through strength, beauty, or status. It is found by those who choose kindness even when no one is watching, because the smallest act of compassion can change not only one life, but the future of an entire kingdom.